Hi friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Kat and today we're going to be doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. So I originally saw this on Books with Emily Fox's channel, and I'm so excited to do this because I am a gigantic fantasy reader, if you didn't know, and I really want to tell you guys a bit more about my tastes, and if you aren't familiar with my channel, get a bit of a better idea of what to expect and what type of books I like to talk about. So there are 9 questions and let's just dive in. Question number 1 is going to be, what is your fantasy origin story? So basically, like, what books got you into fantasy? I feel like this is one of the most basic answers that can ever be said, but I grew up reading Harry Potter, and I basically started reading it when I was in kindergarten. My mom would read it to me as I fell asleep at night, and then as I got older, I would start to read them on my own, and it really is one of those series that captivated my love for reading. But I am going to mention another one, which is the Aragon series, and this is one that I read in middle school, and I think it is definitely the series that like really got me into more epic fantasy type of books. This one, it had dragons, it had adventure, there was a king to slay, like it had so many classic fantasy tropes, and all of it just worked so incredibly well for me. I reread that series like dozens of times as a kid because it was truly one of the best that I ever read. Question 2, if you could be a hero in a story, who would be the writer and what would be the trope? I think I'm gonna have to go with Brandon Sanderson as a writer. I really trust like pretty much anything he writes. I'm not as big a fan of his YA works, but basically any adult fantasy that he's written, I've loved. And they're pretty much guaranteed that they're going to be like a 4 or 5 star read for me. And I think, so my personal favorite trope is a bodyguard romance, and you know what? I kind of would love to see him do one. I think that could be fun. I definitely would be very curious about how he would create this, like what type of world he would do with it, and yeah, I think that would be very interesting to see. Question number 3, what is a fantasy book you've read this year and want other people to read? I'm gonna say, so this is fantasy romance, and I think that pretty much anybody who enjoys fantasy romance would enjoy this book, but I'm gonna say The Serpent and the Wings of Night. It is an incredibly popular book right now, and for very good reason. It is truly like an incredibly fast-paced, fun story. It has a great romance. It's a vampire romance, which I am so happy are starting to make their comeback because I desperately was missing those in my life, and I think it's just like a wonderful example of what fantasy romance can be. Very much like a good intro spot if somebody were perhaps nervous about the genre. 4, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre and what is one that you haven't read much from? My favorite, hands down, urban fantasy. I don't know, like just something about how inventive people can get with these ideas of having our own technology and having all of these like things going on in the world that are similar to our society, but just adding in this magical aspect and seeing how people react, or if there's like shifters or vampires or something, just seeing how that it would impact normal society. I love it. And I don't know, it just, a lot of my favorite series are urban fantasy, and pretty much anytime I see one, I'm gonna read it. I just really love how inventive people can get with it, and a lot of having the modern day aspect. I don't know, it makes it easier to get into as well and easier to read because it's not one of those like intense epic fantasy worlds that you need to learn so much about, and like it's not like a new language. It's just very easy to get sucked into and get immersed in the world. And one that I haven't read much from, historical fantasy. I hate historical books. I will never read a historical romance. I'll never read like historical fiction. I don't enjoy it. I've read a few historical fantasies and none of them have worked for me. It's just, I really don't enjoy the time period. I don't. And when I say the time period, I find they tend to be like Victorian England or like wartime books or something. Like there's definitely certain historical periods maybe I haven't explored enough to see if I enjoy them, but I find the majority of them tend to be like Victorian England, which I don't care about, I'm not interested in, and it just really does not work for me. Question number 5, who are your auto-buy fantasy authors? I have 4 that I thought of who just in recent years have been like my absolute favorite, and authors that I know I can consistently go to get like a very good book. So first off, Brandon Sanderson. That is a very easy one. most fantasy readers are big fans of his as well, but pretty much every one of his books that I've read, I've enjoyed. If not loved, I've deeply enjoyed. And he has several series, like the Mistborn series, Stormlight Archives, that I consistently know I'm going to enjoy. So if there's anything related to that, automatically I buy. Another one, N.K. Jemisin. I really enjoy everything that I've read from her. The most recent ones I've loved is like The City We Became. That fantastic book. Very like, again, urban fantasy, but very different than most of the other books that you read within the genre. And yeah, just all of her books are so creative and really have like some of the most interesting concepts. T. Kingfisher, I've really been enjoying their books lately. She really does a lot of different genres, and her horror sometimes works for me, sometimes doesn't, but I do consistently find that a lot of her fantasy books have been very good reads and ones that I've deeply enjoyed, like Sword Heart or Nettle and Bone are two of my favorite reads from last year. And then also I'm going to mention Fiona Andrews. They're a husband and wife writing duo, and they write two of my favorite urban fantasy series. So no matter what they write, I'm going to give it a try. There's some books from them I haven't really enjoyed, but very consistently they come out with majority 5-star reads for me. So sit in question number 6. How do you typically find fantasy recommendations? And I think for fantasy, I mostly go to BookTube. There are so many fantasy readers on here, and a lot of them do have fairly similar taste to what I read, so it's always very easy to find something that I'll probably like. A few people who I really like, Books with Emily Fox, who created this tag, or who I saw this tag from, Peruse Project, Becca and the Books, Booked and Busy. Those are just a few examples of people who I always know I can go to for a good recommendation, and chances are I'm going to really enjoy the book. Question number 7, upcoming fantasy releases you're excited for. The only ones I actually wrote down are the upcoming Brandon Sanderson secret projects. So 2 have been released so far this year. I read one, which was Trust in the Emerald Sea, and I loved it. I haven't gotten to the second one yet just because I haven't had time, but I am really excited to see what the other 2 books are going to be about, because we know nothing. We don't know titles, we don't know like descriptions, we know literally nothing, and I don't know, that makes me really excited. I can't wait to see where he goes with them, because it could be anything. Question number 8, what is one misconception about fantasy that you want to lay to rest? So this is kind of hard because I don't really think that people tend to judge fantasy readers anymore. Like, I think maybe that happened a lot more in the past, but I feel like fantasy is a very popular genre now. So a lot of people, even if they're not huge fantasy readers, they've read at least a few and recognize that it's not that scary of a genre to get into. So I guess I'm just gonna kind of say also, like, there's nothing wrong with reading entirely for your enjoyment. It doesn't need to be a book that you're learning something from, or a book that's like deeply philosophical and full of knowledge to impart. You can read something entirely just for fun and entirely just to like explore a new world. And question number 9, the final question. If someone who doesn't read a lot of fantasy asks for a recommendation, what are the first 3 books that come to mind? And this was really hard because I have so many fantasy recommendations, and it's really, I was trying to really think of something that has very mass appeal and something that's not super dense, because I think if you give somebody like a really intense like Wheel of Time book as their first fantasy, that might be a little overwhelming and scare someone off the genre. So I have 3 that I think are fairly mass appeal and very easy to get into. First one I'm going to recommend is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is a very fun heist story. It is in a magical world, but it still is very easily understandable because you're following somebody as they're learning more about the world as well. So it's explained very clearly. It has a very unique magic system. There's an oppressive leader who is trying to be taken down, and it's very interesting. It has so many common fantasy tropes, but it works perfectly well for that, you know, like it really creates just a super compelling and interesting story. The next one I'd recommend is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. So I know a lot of people would probably recommend reading A Court of Thorns and Roses first, but A Court of Thorns and Roses series, but I think Throne of Glass is a very fun series in that it starts off very light fantasy. Like there's a little like inkling of it. There's a little like hints of magic in there. And as you go through the series, it progressively gets more and more intense in this like magical fantasy world. But the first book is very much just an assassin competition, which it's very, very exciting because you are following this girl who's going through this competition against all of these other assassins. So it's super fast paced, it's super fun, and you're learning more about this fantasy world and also like uncovering this mystery of there once was magic, but now there is not. And I personally think that it is a fantastic starting point for Sarah J. Maas if you're ever interested in getting into her works. And then the last one I'm going to recommend is an urban fantasy. It is Burn for Me by Ione Andrews, and this is a world, so urban fantasy, it's a world very similar to ours, except there had been this serum created that gave individuals magical abilities. So now there is this huge magical society, and it's very broken down by power, by levels of magical power. There's many families who have different types of magic, so it's really cool to see like all of these different possible abilities and what people do with them, like how they could use them for good or how they use them for bad. You're following a private investigator who is trying to hunt down this guy who is a fire user and attacked somebody very publicly. So it's just a very interesting world. There's a fantastic romance in it. It is just like very, very addicting once you get into this series. All right, so there you have it. That was my get to know the fantasy reader tag. So if you guys have not already, please consider subscribing because I love talking about fantasy books, and yeah, this is kind of my favorite thing. And hopefully I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.